Motor reflexes. Reflex actions are based on a sequence of events involving a receptor, an effector neuron or arc, and an effector. This is a typical monosynaptic reflex, that is, there is only one synapse, consequently little delay in transmission within the pathway. An example of such a reflex is the myotatic reflex, the combination of the receptor muscle spindle, afferent sensory nerve, efferent motor nerve, and effector striated muscle fiber is called a myotatic unit. There may be other neurons that exist between the afferent and efferent arms of the reflex, and these are called connectors or internuncial neurons. Consequently, depending on the number of internuncial cells, these could be disynaptic or multisynaptic. Reflexes are classified based on their pathways passing through segments of spinal cord or based on a clinical approach. Based on the segmental approach, there are segmental, intersegmental, and suprasegmental reflexes. And segmental reflex passes through the single segment of the spinal cord, while intersegmental reflex have ascending or descending paths in the spinal cord. An example of a segmental reflex is the tendon reflex, while superficial reflexes are usually intersegmental. Suprasegmental reflexes have long pathways that involve different nuclei above the level of the spinal cord. Clinically, reflexes are classified based on where they are elicited, like superficial, deep, and visceral. According to segmental approach, they are intersegmental, suprasegmental, and segmental. Okay, clinically, reflexes are classified based on where they are elicited, superficial, deep, and visceral. Examples of this are the plantar reflex and the tendon reflexes and the papillary reflex, respectively. Sometimes a reflex may be altered in pathological states. An example is the Babinski reflex, which is an altered planar reflex. This is called a pathological reflex. Segmental, intrasegmental, and suprasegmental reflexes. Another classification: superficial, deep, and visceral. Okay, then properties of reflexes. As explained earlier, reflexes have defined structures and their properties vary depending on their classification. Therefore, monosynaptic reflexes are very fast. Monosynaptic reflexes are very fast, of the order of 0.5 milliseconds, while multisynaptic reflexes are slower in latency of a few milliseconds. Reciprocal innervations occur, meaning that the excitation due to the reflex on one set of muscles is accompanied by inhibition of the other. For example, this means that flexion and extension cannot simultaneously be accomplished on the same limb. This reciprocal intervention reflects an organization of the nervous system. Reciprocal innervation and extends to the contralateral side as well. There is a flexure reflex on one side is accompanied by an inhibition of the same reflex and an augmentation of the opposite muscle reflex on the opposite side. Once again, this reciprocal innervation reflects an organization of the nervous system at this spinal level and extends to the contralateral side as well, where a flexure reflex on one side is accompanied by an inhibition of the same reflex on an augmentation of the opposite muscle reflex on the opposite side. Flexure reflex and withdrawal reflexes. On the spinal or decerebrate animal, almost any type of cutaneous sensory stimulus from a limb is likely to cause the flexure muscle of the limb to contract, thereby withdrawing the limb muscles of the limb to contract, thereby withdrawing the limb from the stimulating object. This reflex is called flexure reflex. It is in its classic form. The flexure reflex is elicited most powerfully by stimulation of pain endings such as pin, prick, heat, or a wound, or which reason it is also called a nociceptive reflex. In the case, nociceptive in the sense pain producing or pain reflex, and also known as pain reflex. Stimulation of touch receptors can also elicit a weaker and a less prolonged flexure reflex. Now forget the term flexure reflex. If some part of the body other than one of the limbs is painfully stimulated, that part will remain similarly withdrawn from the stimulus, but the reflex may not be confined to the flexure muscle, even though it is basically the same type of reflex. Therefore, the many patterns of the reflexes in the different areas of the body are called withdrawal reflexes. Then Neuronal mechanism of the flexure reflex. The left-hand portion shows a neuronal pathway for the flexure reflex. In this instance, a painful stimulus is applied to the hand. As a result, the flexure muscles of the upper arm become excited, thus withdrawing the hand from the painful stimulus. The pathways for eliciting the flexure reflex do not pass directly to the anterior motor neurons, but instead pass first into the spinal cord interneuron pool of neurons and only secondary to the motor neurons. The shortest possible circuit is a 3 or 4 neuron pathway. However, most of the signals of a reflex transfers many more neurons are involved in the following basic type of circuits: diverging circuits to spread the reflex to necessary muscles for withdrawal, circuits to inhibit the antagonistic muscle called reciprocal inhibition circuits, and circuits to cause after discharge that lasts many fractions of the second after the stimulus is over. So when we try to learn about a myogram from the flexure muscle during a flexure reflex, within a few milliseconds after the pain nerve begins to be stimulated, the flexure response appears. Then in the next few seconds, the flexure begins to fatigue. Reflex begins to fatigue, which is characteristic of essentially all complex integrative reflexes of the spinal cord. Finally, after the stimulus is over, the contraction of the muscle returns toward the baseline, but because of after discharge, it takes many milliseconds for this contraction to occur. The duration of after discharge depends on the intensity of the sensory stimulus that elicits the reflex. The weak tactile stimulus causes almost no after discharge, but after a strong pain stimulus, the after discharge may last for a second or more. So, properties of reflexes. The principle of convergence, increased facilitation or decreased occlusion discharge into the reflex arc could occur. The principle of divergence, one single afferent nerve can excite a large number of spinal neurons, leading to a greater reflex response. Then, post-tetanic potentiation, repetitive stimulation of the afferent nerve prior to applying a single stimulus elicits a greater reflex response. This potentiation becomes less dependent on how much time interval there is between conditioning burst of the repetitive stimuli and the single stimulus. Rebound inhibition is followed by a state of increased excitation. Then Renshaw inhibition, negative feedback control that damps down reflex discharge. When you try to learn about the components of a reflex arc, you could see portions like effector muscle, efferent arc, anterior horn, internuntial neuron, spinal cord, posterior horn of the spinal cord, then afferent arc and a receptor. These are the major portions. Flexure reflex, closed exterior extensor reflex, and reciprocal inhibition. Reciprocal inhibition, polysynaptic circuit inhibited excited painful stimulus from hand, inhibited excited flexure reflex, and closed extensor reflex. These are very important. When the after discharge that occurs in the flexure reflex almost certainly results from both types of repetitive discharge circuits. So electrophysiological studies indicate immediate after discharge lasting for about 6 to 8 milliseconds result from repetitive firing of the excited interneuron themselves. Also prolonged after discharge occurs after strong pain stimuli, almost certainly resulting from recurrent pathways that initiate oscillation in reverberating interneuron circuits. This in turn transmit impulses to the anterior motor neurons, sometimes for several seconds after the incoming sensory signal is over. Thus, the flexure reflex is appropriately organized into withdraw a pained or otherwise irritated part of the body from a stimulus. Further, because of the after discharge, the reflex can hold the irritated part away from the stimulus after the irritation is over. During this time, other reflexes and actions of the central nervous system can move the entire body away from the painful stimulus. The pattern of the withdrawal during flexure reflex. The pattern of withdrawal that results when the flexure reflex is elicited depends on which sensory nerve is stimulated. This pain stimulus on the inward side of an arm elicits not only contraction of the flexure muscle of the arm but also contraction of the abductor muscles to pull the arm outward. In other words, the integrative centers of the cord cause the muscles to contract that can most effectively remove the pained part of the body away from the object causing the pain. Although this principle applies to any part of the body, it is especially applicable to the limbs because of their highly developed flexure reflexes. Then closed extensor reflex. About 0.2 to 0.5 seconds after a stimulus elicits a flexure reflex in one limb, the opposite limb begins to extend. This reflex is called the closed extensor reflex. Extension of the opposite limb can push the entire body away from the object, causing the painful stimulus into withdrawal limb. Neuronal mechanism of the crossed extensor reflex. The right-hand portion of the figure shows the neuronal circuit responsible for the crossed extensor reflex, demonstrating that signals from sensory nerves cross to the opposite side of the cord to excite extensor muscles. Because the crossed extensor reflex usually does not begin until 200 to 500 milliseconds after onset of the initial pain stimulus. It is certain that many interneurons are involved in the circuit between the incoming sensory neuron and the motor neurons of the opposite side of the cord responsible for the crossed extension. After the painful stimulus is removed, the crossed extension reflex has an even longer period of after discharge than the flexure reflex. Again, it is presumed that it is prolonged after discharge results from overbearing circuits among the interneuronal cells. So, a typical myogram recorded from a muscle involved in crossing extensor reflex. This myogram demonstrates that a relatively long latency before the reflex begins and a long aftercharge at the end of stimulus. The prolonged aftercharge discharge is beneficial for holding the pained area of the body away from the painful object until other nerve reactions cause the entire body to move away. Then reciprocal inhibition and reciprocal innervation. We previously pointed out that excitation of one group of muscle is often associated with inhibition of another group. For instance, when a stretch reflex excites one muscle, it often simultaneously inhibits the antagonist muscle, which is the phenomenon of reciprocal inhibition. And the neuronal circuit that causes this reciprocal relaxation is called a reciprocal innervation. Likewise, reciprocal relations often exist between the muscles of the two sides of the body, as exemplified by the flexor and the extensor muscles. Reciprocal inhibition example. In this instance, a moderate but prolonged flexor reflex is elicited from one limb of the body. While this reflex is still being elicited, a stronger flexor reflex is elicited in the limb on the opposite side of the body. The stronger reflex sends reciprocal inhibitory signals to the first limb and depresses its degree of flexion. Finally, removal of the stronger reflex allows the original reflex to resume its previous intensity. In spinal cord reflexes that cause muscle spasm, in human beings, local muscle spasm is often observed. In many, if not most instances, localized pain is the cause of the local spasm. Muscle spasm resulting from a broken bone. One type of clinically important spasm occurs in muscles that surround a broken bone. The spasm results from pain impulses initiated from the broken edges of the bone, which cause the muscles that surround the area to contract tonically. Pain relief obtained by injecting a local anesthetic at the broken edges of the bone relieves the spasm. A deep general anesthetic of the entire body, such as either anesthesia, also relieves the spasm. Then abdominal muscle spasm in persons with peritonitis. Another type of local spasm caused by cold reflexes is abdominal spasm resulting from irritation of the parietal peritoneum by peritonitis. Here again, relief of the pain caused by the peritonitis allows the spastic muscles to relax. The same type of spasm occurs when during surgical operations, for instance during abdominal operations. Pain impulses from the parietal peritoneum often cause the abdominal muscles to contract extensively, sometimes extruding the intestines through the surgical wound. For this reason, deep anesthesia is usually required for intra-abdominal operations. Then muscle cramp. Another type of local spasm is the typical muscle cramp you might have probably experienced. Any local irritating factor or metabolic abnormality of a muscle, such as severe cold, lack of blood flow, or overexercise, can elicit pain or other sensory signals transmitted from the muscle to the spinal cord, which in turn cause reflex feedback muscle contraction. The contraction is believed to stimulate the same sensory receptors even more, which cause the spinal cord to increase the intensity of contraction. This positive feedback develops, so a small amount of initial irritation causes more and more contraction until a full-blown muscle cramp appears.